A message if we're live. Live now. Okay, good. Hey, so I'm going to introduce you properly. My name is Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest is Jonathan Rauch. Jonathan Rauch is Senior Fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer of The Atlantic. And he is the author of a book that I just finished this morning, which I like a lot. I think it's a terrific and important book called Kind. Um, Well, no, he's an author of another book called Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, and that's 1993. And the one that I'm talking about today is Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. And it just came out about a month ago. And I finished reading it this morning, and I think what I'll do is kind of dive into the book with some quotes here that I want to read, and they're not in any order of the book, but you start with something I think around page 95, where you say, in other words, the first order of the day is not to claim supremacy for either religious or secular law, or declare an existential clash, but to look together for ways to mitigate conflict. And that's kind of the bottom line of your book. And you take it to an interesting place because you identify yourself as gay, Jewish, an atheist, with a high regard for religion, as well as a critique of a lot of the movements to the right of the evangelical and Christian world that I'm part of. And then you wind up at the end of your book, surprisingly, talking about some of the things that one particular strand of Christianity has done well in your regard, which is the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons. Takes an interesting twist there. So in describing the book, gay atheist comes out in favor of Mormons or something like that is the way the Daily Mail would do it. But
Yep, homosexual, atheistic, Jews for Jesus, and Mormons.
that's it.
Not where I
Exactly.
plan to be at this stage in my
Yeah,
career.
exactly. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And you were asking me a little about myself, and I was just saying that I come from an evangelical background, and some of my memoirs have been about my background, excuse me, from a sort of a critical point of view of having traveled beyond, for myself, the world I came from and more into the world you're writing about. So what I first want to ask you have a lovely introduction to the book and also kind of an epilogue where you're writing to a friend of yours. So rather than reading that out, I would like you to describe the kind of journey from being a university student with a friend who was a Christian, which you kind of look down on a little bit, to the place you're at now. And that's sort of the story of your book, but let's start with that.
Well, journey is the word. I was born in 1960 and very early on realized that I was different from most people. And one of those dimensions was being Jewish, minority religion, of course. Another was that I also realized early on that belief in God seemed to me like an unfounded superstition. I tried at one point when I was 14. I couldn't do it. And then from a very early age, like age 5 or 6, I knew that I felt a powerful attraction of some sort to boys and men. And of course, later I understood, much later, I came to understand what that meant.
Mm.
And I grew up with a bad attitude toward Christianity because to people like me, and in my world, it seemed like it was hypocritical and cruel. And I
Mm.
was not wrong about that. The first inkling that there might be another side of Christianity, an ennobling side, came when I was paired up in college with a roommate, a young man named Mark McIntosh, who was a Christian through and through, not a plaster saint, sense of
Yeah.
humor and got angry and whatever, but his life was really infused on a day-to-day basis with what does it mean to be Christian and what would Jesus want me to do? He later became a very prominent theologian, professor, and priest, Anglican priest, famous
Mm.
guy, Mark McIntosh. And that was the beginning of a long process of understanding that Christianity can be something very different from what I originally thought it was. Even so, in 2003, I was still celebrating in print the dumbest article I ever wrote, which celebrated secularization. It said, "Isn't it great that America's, leaving religion behind, just
Mm,
becoming more like Scandinavia, will be more harmonious and less dogmatic and divided." And boy, was I wrong until I felt that I had to write this book to rectify that error, to apologize to Mark McIntosh,
mm,
and to argue to secular people and to Christians that Christianity has a critical role to play in bringing our country together instead of pulling it apart.
mm. Well, one thing I want to tell people is I finished reading this book, and one of my thoughts was that, Jonathan is I guess you could say an academic, but the book is not only readable and beautifully written, you clearly made a decision in the process, even though I think Yale University Press published it, to not write an academic book. Um, it's a book about a spiritual journey, if you want to put it that way, that where you wind up at a very different place as an atheist, not so much in terms of your core belief, if I understand the book correctly, but in terms of the way you see uh, people who are believers. And you're very positive about aspects of belief in a way that most critics of, say, Christian nationalism or the movement of the evangelicals towards Trump are not. One thing that you say, a little sort of a third through the book, just to quote here, I don't think secularism is primarily responsible for Christianity's infirmities, but I do think it could and should be more helpful within the confines of the Constitution's commitment not to promote religion. Let's kind of, in terms of what the book is about, let's start with that because that's an interesting kind of synopsis of your view of fairness to Christianity and to religion, but at the same time a critique. So if you want to just take that line and talk about the context and what you're saying in the book, that is kind of a description of.
Sure, I'd love to. I'll just say by way of self-identification that I'm a journalist, not a professor.
Okay.
My highest degree is a bachelor's, so I'm a mister, not a doctor.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I write better than
Yeah.
an academic, because I really try. So um, there are people out there, often called post-liberals,
Hmm.
among other things, integralists, who blame people like me for the decline and crisis of Christianity in America. They
Hmm.
say it's because secular liberals has made it impossible to defend faith and family and country and tradition. And I don't think that's true. I think the reasons for Christianity's decline has to do mostly with tragic choices that Christians have made. But having said all that, there is an element of truth in the critique of secular liberals like me. I mean, liberals in the sense of, Madisonian liberals like the founders, not left-wing progressives. And I think we did neglect
Hmm.
Christianity for too long, and often we were too hostile to it.
Hmm.
So, for example, I'm a gay American. I'm for equal rights. But I don't think it's necessary to require every single mom and pop cake baker in the country to cater same-sex weddings. I think we can do without that.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to rid the public square of all religious symbols. I think it's okay up to a point to
Hmm.
teach the Bible in school as not necessarily to convert people, not as Christian truth, but as a civilizational foundation. I think diversity programs in workplaces and schools and newsrooms should make sure that people of faith feel welcome in those environments, feel they can be open about it. Often they can. In short, I don't think we liberals, at least until very recently, have understood that Christianity is a load-bearing wall in our democracy. It does a lot of the core work of socializing people into the values that the founders called Republican virtues, the things, ways of life you need to exhibit
Hmm.
in a democracy, things like truthfulness, lawfulness, civility, forgiveness. Um, and we forgot that. And so I think we do need to do a better job of
Hmm.
creating space, civic space, for
Yeah.
people of faith in general and for Christians in particular.
Yeah. And that sort of goes with a quote here from page 128, where you say liberal ideology too has drifted toward rigid church-state separation, not just legally, but culturally and attitudinally. And of course, that's sort of what you're talking about here. Um, so maybe you just want to talk a little bit about how in the book you, I won't say balance, but how you go back and forth through the entire book between a critique of the extremes of the kind of rightward drift of the Christian movement and what it's cost, but at the same time, talking about what you were just saying a moment ago, the attitude of the the liberal, more liberal people has been one that in a way has, I guess the way I think of it, trolled Christians, you know, in important ways that are similar to the way I guess um, the right wing trolls, liberals, want to own the libs, this kind of thing. There's been a lot of unnecessary aggravation, I think, over the last 50, 60 years, which has been, resulted in, I think, a lost election and put Trump in the White House again. And there's a lot of threads in that tapestry. But one of them is the anger that has come from people who not only feel marginalized in terms of the economics, which people at the New York Times and other places are more competent and willing to talk about, but less this kind of cultural divide, whether it's baking cakes for gay weddings or whatever it may be, that are put there in ways by people that constantly challenge the basic assumptions of people who were not as politicized before, but I think enough so now. So, talk about that a little bit. Just take that a step further in terms of that quote from the book that I just mentioned about liberal ideology too has drifted toward rigid church-state separation. Just amplify that a little bit.
Well, this is the kind of situation that you see when groups that I do have a lot of sympathy with, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, for example, or the ACLU, with very good intentions, are trying to make sure that church and state don't get too entangled. The founders separated them because they understood that bringing them close together could weaken both. But here's the thing. So it turns out the founders also told us, however, something else. That's what I'm about to say. And that's they gave us a constitution and a form of government, but
Mm,
they also told us that the fundamental values that uphold our democracy, our constitution, don't come from the constitution itself. They have to come from outside.
mm,
And by that, they meant civil society. And by that, they meant family and community and education. But they very prominently meant religion, which to them meant Christianity, especially
mm,
white Protestantism, which is still the dominant thread in America. And so what they were saying is, look, our democracy is not self-sufficient. It needs support
mm,
from a sense from religion, from Christianity, that will inculcate in people, educate people into what they called Republican virtues, those
mm,
things I mentioned earlier: lawfulness, truthfulness, civility, toleration, and pluralism, um, being well educated, and well educated in, in civic matters. And they told us in as many words, Washington in his farewell address, and
mm,
Hamilton in his letters, and Madison in the Richmond Convention ratifying the Constitution. They said without Republican virtue, the Constitution will fail.
mm,
So, what that means is that although the missions of Christianity and secular democracy are very different, and although they should never be interwoven to be the same thing,
mm.
we should not have a Christian government or nation.
Yeah.
They do need each other. I liken them to two planks of wood,
Mm,
two flat boards. They don't stand up by themselves, but they can lean on each other. So they're interdependent. And that's what I missed back in 2003. I just thought, well, okay, we don't need this Christianity thing anymore because our liberal democracy is so well established and consolidated. But what happened, Frank, that I didn't foresee,
mm.
but should have, is secularization, the mass flight from Christianity. The numbers here are unprecedented. I can give you some of them.
Yeah.
But we're seeing an extraordinary collapse of Christianity in the US. It may have bottomed out in the last year or two. We'll see. But that's caused waves of cascading secularization. One is in the hole that Christianity has made. You see pseudo religions that are things like,
Mhm.
self-improvement, Wicca, crystals, soul cycle. They're not bad for you, but they don't do the job of bringing a 2,000-year-old tradition to bear on how we should
Yeah.
behave as human beings, why we're here on earth, what's the foundation of good and evil. Then you get another wave of pseudo religion, and these are the ones that are actively toxic, that divide us. This is QAnon and radical environmentalism and radical wokeness and radical MAGA. And those are actively toxic.
Mm.
They acculturate us against living together. And then you get the third thing, which may be the most destructive of all. Without Christianity in the mix, politics, partisan politics, becomes our religion. It becomes a source of identity for people. Who am I? Well, I'm someone who fights the other party. And that makes us ungovernable because politics has got to be about bargaining so that we can live together, not having apocalyptic battles. So those are the things that I missed, and those are the things that I think too many secular liberals like me missed.
Yeah, and those are the things I think your book, if I may say so, addresses brilliantly, and why I hope a lot of people read it and talk about it. I'm just going to reintroduce you. I'm talking to Jonathan Rauch, and his book is Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Just been out for about a month. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm asking you to subscribe right now on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, it has to be said commentary at frankschaeffer.substack.com. Let me jump back into the book here and just go to the flip side of what you were just saying. When American Christians throw in their lot with the MAGA movement, they're joining a movement which was very accurately described by President Joe Biden as semi-fascist. True, MAGA lacks certain characteristics, elements of 20th century European style um, fascism, militarism, totalism, explicit racism, and anti-Semitism. Yet there are many other elements of fascism which MAGA emulates. Rejection of elections, check. Contempt for law, check. Corrupt use of government power, check. Nostalgia for purer, simpler times, check. Populist attacks on the enemies of the people, check, and so forth and so on. So let me just see where that is. That's sort of in the third way, page 80 something. Um, but what I wanted to point out is that one thing I found interesting about your book that is if you take quotes out of context like that one, you would say, okay, that fits in with Tim Alberta's book on the kingdom, the power, and the glory. And yet, if you take another quote out of your book on what we miss about sort of the basic Christian presuppositions that were this other plank leaning against the Constitution, if you want to put it that way, and propping it up. Um, I find the book very unusual because it's odd. You've kind of lived through the book what you're calling for. It's not a bunch of, on the other hand, this and that and the other. You follow these twin thoughts through the book with a kind of an equal passion, and I find that very unusual because by the end of the book, when you talk about the Church of the Latter-day Saints and Mormonism and what it's done right, it's a great thing because by the end you're saying, okay, show us an example of a way forward in terms of something that points towards religious people being able to live with the secular people. And I like that. So I'd like you to, I know that, we're not talking about the end of your book at this point, but I'd like you to unpack why you use that as an example. I think people would find that really interesting. Why the Mormons come to mind, because they're not the main thread of Christianity. On the other hand, they're the example you use.
Yeah, some evangelicals, many don't even consider Mormons to be Christian. That they worship Jesus Christ, so that's enough for me. And I should say, I'm not saying that anyone needs to become a Latter-day Saint
Right.
or that their theology should be copied by other Christians. I am saying that they can be an inspiration
Mm.
to other Christians. And they were an inspiration to me in writing this book. I was so amazed in 2015. So I'm gay, and cause of my life is same-sex marriage and LGBT equality. And in 2015, to my astonishment, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints led a coalition in Utah that included Equality Utah, that's the LGBT group, and conservative Republicans in the legislature that put through what's called the Utah Compromise.
mm,
It included civil rights for LGBT people in law, that was new in Utah, plus specific religious liberty protections for people of faith. And it carved out increasing space for both. And
mm,
it was inspirational and it changed the whole cultural dynamic of the state to one that's friendlier to LGBT people and created these relationships that are still going on that are helping solve political problems. And then in 2022, they did it again, even more amazingly. So I'm married to a guy,
mhm.
but the fear has been that the conservative Supreme Court could yank that away.
Yeah.
The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was an important part of a coalition of groups in the religious world that supported the Respect for Marriage Act,
Yeah.
which wrote my marriage into federal law and included important new religious liberty protections so that the government, federal government, cannot use tax breaks and contracts and nonprofit status and whatever as cudgels to force any of those faiths
Mm.
to accept same-sex marriage. So I looked at this. This is astounding, right? This is so
Sure.
countercultural.
Well, and you point out very clearly, nobody's changed their basic theology. Nobody's changed their moral structure. They're just talking about how do we live with people
How do we
in a
live
peaceable
together?
way in a culture
How do
we don't
we
run.
Yeah, this was about deconflicting. This is about, so instead of always just being at war with each other in a zero-sum game, how do we expand the space to live together? So I started looking at this church and discovered that they are in a project right now of creating, they have a fully articulated civic theology which answers a question that white evangelicals have not been able to answer, and that is, how would Jesus Christ like us to behave, not just in our family life or church life or community life, but in civic life, meaning social media and politics.
Mm,
And they've got a developed answer to that that goes all the way back to their account of the Garden of Eden, and that is that we should behave in civic life to the fullest extent we can. We should we should strive for patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation.
mm,
Don't pull the culture war trigger. You know, we got to win, they got to lose. Do the opposite of that. They call this peacemaking.
mm,
They're putting it into practice. It's deeply theologically grounded. It's not about convenience at all. The
mm,
theology is explained in the book. And so I look at this and I say, well, this is an attempt, just one of a number of attempts that are out there right now for
mm,
Christians to define, okay, our politics is a mess. What can Christianity bring from its deepest principles to our civic life and our politics
yeah.
that will help repair it and make it more in the image of Jesus? They've got
Mm,
one answer to that. Other Christians have others.
mm,
But that's where my hope is that Christianity can begin to bring the ideas of Jesus Christ
mm. You set
to
this up a little bit
politics.
in the book when you write, in short, we have standing to hope, perhaps even insist that Christians get their act together. In doing so, we are not asking Christianity to be anything other than itself. We are asking that it eschew fear, imitate Jesus, and forgive, thereby keeping its commitments to God and liberal democracy. Michael Weir makes this point eloquently, quote, the Christian's responsibility for our politics is special, but not because Christians are or should be privileged by law, or because America is a, quote, Christian nation. For too long, Christians have asserted special status for this country, all while avoiding special responsibility. We share with our fellow citizens, Christians and others, the responsibility in and for our politics in the eyes of the law. And you're quoting him. Just tell us a little bit about who that is and amplify what you were saying, which kind of fits in with what you were just setting up in terms of your interest in the Mormon theology.
Yeah, Michael Weir is a guy who's been involved in politics on the Democratic side, but he was part of the faith-based outreach of several campaigns. He
Hmm.
is uh, he is a Christian, and he's written an important new book called "The Spirit of Our Politics," which is what I was quoting from there. But he's also
Mhm.
founded a Christian group, the Center for Christianity and Public Life, which is working on exactly the project that we've been talking about, which is figuring out, okay, how can Christians bring the teachings of the gospel and of Jesus to our public life in a positive way? And there are other Christians doing that. A group called the After Party, affiliated with another group called Redeeming Babel, is in that space. A
Mm.
group called the One America Movement, which is working with pastors on depolarizing churches. Churches have been infected with partisan politics, and pastors hate that. That's not why they want to be there. And so this is a way that this gives a pastor's tools
By
to
which,
begin
by the way, is the
refocusing.
subject of, I talked about Tim Alberta, The
Hmm.
Kingdom and the Power and the Glory. He kind of, that again is a surprising book because it's a critique. And then he comes out as, calls himself an evangelical Christian. And it's in the context of pastors lamenting what's happening to their own congregations.
Yeah, there was a poll that consulting group called Barna Christian Group conducted of pastors, I think 3 years ago now, asking pastors if they'd seriously considered quitting over the past year.
Hmm.
And 42% said yes. And when
Yeah.
I asked pastors the same question informally in my interviews, most of them said yes. One said 4 times. And when Barna asked why they considered quitting, the first two I don't remember specifically, but they're the obvious ones, like low pay and stressful job. But number three
Yeah.
was politics.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of desire among Christians in the church to pull back from the sort of politicized pathway that the white evangelical church has been on over the past several decades and rededicate to the teachings of Christ. And
Mm.
that's a sign for hope.
Yeah, you say I owe to my regular and deep engagement these past few years with friends in the religious world. And then you talk about my claim is not just that secular liberalism and religious faith are instrumentally interdependent, but that each is intrinsically reliant on the other to build a morally and epistemically complete and coherent account of the world. In other words, the structure of the moral and epistemic universe is such that both ways of thought are incomplete, even in principle, although they are always in tension and sometimes in outright conflict. Neither by itself will ever be able to satisfy human needs to cope with the world. And that's a wonderful statement, one that I would sign my name to happily in a heartbeat. Let's talk a little bit about what has happened in our culture where you have many, many people who identify themselves as Democrat voting liberals who would be your younger self in terms of their attitude to good riddance to all this Christian bullshit. You know, it's all about the malfeasance of the Roman Catholic Church and all this stuff. And, who needs all this? We're moving beyond this. But then on the other hand, the MAGA movement, which often claims the mantle of Christianity, but seems to be drifting very, very far from it. Talk a little bit about what you think's happened to us in the last 50 years, both what's in your book, but what's outside of it. Just how would you explain this to someone from another planet? We sort of said, well, why do you all seem to hate each other so much? And do you really, or are there more people in a majority that don't, and it's just leaders on the loud, algorithmically, amplified fringe? How would you kind of explain how we got here and where we actually are, not where we think we are based on what's on our phones, but what's our actual situation as you see it in terms of this mutual antagonism between people who are cut in the mold of your old liberal self before you started to ask some real questions about our history and religion. And then on the other side, the MAGA movement, as it claims the mantle of Christianity, all the way up to armed militia groups and whatever it may be. Um, I think a lot of us are trying to explain this moment to ourselves and live in it at the same time. And there's a lot of tension in doing that. So how would you do that?
Well, that's a question we could spend an hour or a year on. There's so many factors. And there are two aspects, I think, bundled in your question. One is the secular aspect of what happened, and that's a big story. And the other is the non-secular, the religious aspect of what happened. And the secular aspect is something that political scientists and survey researchers have spent, just huge amounts on. America is, by most measures, more polarized politically than it has been since the Civil War. And it's not just that it's polarized on policy. That wouldn't be so bad. Tax rates too high, too low. You figure out a compromise. It's what's called affective polarization. And that means it's not just that people disagree on policy, it's that they actively fear and hate each other.
Hmm.
They identify deeply with a political tribe and they think the other side is evil.
Mm.
And they don't want to compromise with the other side. And they'll vote against, especially in partisan primaries,
Yeah.
they'll vote against people who want to compromise. And that means the people attracted to politics are people who abjure compromise. And this
Mm.
becomes a self-fulfilling cycle because then Congress breaks down because it can't make a deal. And then as compromise breaks down in Congress, the country gets even more fractured. Immigration problems don't get solved. You get more polarization. And that's the cycle we're in right now. And it's a very dangerous cycle. You know,
Mm.
it could cost us our democracy. That could even happen within the next 4 years. Some
Yeah.
people really fear that we might not even have a free and fair election in 2028. I'm not
Mm.
there, but this is an extreme condition for us. So that's the secular side.
Mm.
On the religious side, the one word answer to what's happened is the word secularization.
Mm.
And so we talked earlier about how the founders relied on religion, specifically Christianity,
Mm.
to do the job of socializing people into Republican virtues, making them virtuous, good people, and giving them a sense of meaning in life,
Mm.
answering question, why am I here? Am I more than a clump of cells? What's the difference between good and evil? And so there have been two great waves of secularization.
Mm.
The first was the decline of the so-called mainline church,
Yeah.
ecumenical church, and that happens in the second half of the 20th century. When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, the United Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalian Church, these were the pillars of American society. You can't
Mm.
overstate how important they are. And 70% of Americans were church members. And the first thing people often asked each other, not where are you from or what do you do or where'd you go to college? It's what church do you belong to?
Yeah.
Those churches declined, and sociologists think it's because they secularized.
Yeah.
They went down the road of moving away from scripture, being countercultural, in the teachings of Jesus, and more to just getting involved in public affairs and culture and politics from a point of view of a kind of general left-wing social justice
Yeah.
viewpoint. And a lot of people thought, well, if I'm doing, social justice, I don't have to give up a Sunday for that.
Yeah.
And they drifted off. By the end of the 20th century, the mainline churches were just a fragment of their former self.
Mm. Mm.
So the story in the year 2000 is mainline churches decline, but evangelical church is rising fast. But then the second wave of secularization really hits, and that's politicization.
Mm.
White evangelical church starts in the 80s and then through the 90s and beyond, associating itself more and more with the Republican Party.
Mhm.
And they gradually become inseparable. And the church thinks it can influence the party and partisan politics without being fundamentally influenced itself in exchange.
Mm.
And it loses that bet. So, especially in this century, especially since 2010, the white evangelical church and the Republican Party effectively merged. So the candidates since John McCain,
Sure.
presidential candidates, get 80+% of the evangelical vote. And then Trump and the MAGA era turbocharged that.
Yeah.
Um, and that brings politics into the church and it brings the church into politics. And that means that both stop being able to do a large part of the job they're
Mm.
doing. Church becomes increasingly about politics and not transcendent values and not about scripture and Jesus. And politics becomes infected with the zeal of apocalyptic religion. So
Mm.
neither can do its job, and here we are.
Yeah. And here we are. We're talking about Jonathan Rauch's new book, Cross Purposes Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. And it is out now. It's going to be our has to be read selection in June in our book club. And I'm urging people to read it and to talk about it. It's a very important book. It's very well written. And Jonathan's someone who is also writes for the Atlantic, and we have a lot of friends in the Atlantic we've interviewed on this podcast. So it fits in very well with what we're doing. And I want to grab a quote from the book here, which sort of follows on from what you're talking about. Um, Early in the book, you say, in this chapter, I drill down into a central cause of today's misalignment, which I call sharp Christianity, a divisive, fearful, partisan, unchristlike version of Christianity. You want to just talk about that a little bit and how that plays out as a theme through the book. And I like the term, uh, just unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I'll mention in this context, I have three terms in the book. The first is thin Christianity, and that's what we just talked about, which is when the church just begins to blend into the society around it, stops being
Yeah,
relevant. And then sharp Christianity, which is what I just described happened to
yeah.
the evangelical church. And that's when it becomes politicized and secularized. As a result of that, it starts to shrink. The numbers
Mm,
begin to drop because people who are there for Jesus and more traditional Christian things begin to drift away. And people who come to the church not to go to services, but because it's part of the partisan Republican conservative brand, drift into the church. And this changes the complexion of the church. It not only gets smaller, it gets narrower. In other words, sharper. And that's what's happened to the white evangelical church.
yeah. And you talk another aspect here, same section of the book, you say liberalism requires us to share power and sometimes relinquish it. It requires us to keep faith with the Constitution even when we aren't winning. It thus requires us to overcome our political fears and approach politics in a spirit of courageous mutuality. The Church of Fear does the opposite. So that's another term. Let's talk about the Church of Fear a little bit.
So there are three essential tenets of Christianity, according to Christians, and they're all also essential tenets of liberal democracy. And the first of the three is don't be afraid, the most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible, and some say also in the Jewish Bible. God has a plan for you. Don't panic. Um, there's a famous parable in the New Testament. Jesus and the apostles are on a ship at sea, and a storm comes up, and the ship begins to founder, and they panic. They think they'll drown, so they rush to wake Jesus, who is asleep. And they say, Lord, save us. And he just says, stay calm, and goes back to sleep. And the ship, of course, is a metaphor for our transient life on this world. And Jesus' message is a statement of, keep your eyes fixed on the next world, not the next election. It's a fearful world, it's a scary world, but Christianity counsels stay calm, stay
Mm,
focused on the transcendent things in life because you will make better decisions
mm,
if you do that. And the Church of Fear does the opposite. The white evangelical church has increasingly been organized around a sense of existential threat.
mm,
It's the threat from the culture, the cell phones, my kid's going to be trans, come home with a sex change. Fear of demographic change. The number of Christians is shrinking fast. They'll be in a minority of the population before long. So fear of losing that predominance that white Protestantism has always
mm,
enjoyed. Fear of being, um, of losing in political battles. And that fear has become a defining element of the white evangelical church. And pastors hate that more than anyone. One
yeah.
pastor I interviewed calls it the battlefield mindset.
Mm,
And he's, the pastors have to go into church every day and fight this in their communities. But what they say is, I get them for 2 hours a week if I'm lucky, and cable news gets them for 12 hours or more.
a day.
Yeah, maybe a day.
Yeah.
So that becomes a real fight for the church to preserve that injunction. Don't be afraid.
Yeah, well, you sort of sum some of that up when you say, remember, though, that Christian nationalism is not a religious creed, but a political one, which explains why its influence extends beyond the pews to the Republican Party's conservative base more broadly. Talk a little more about that process of politicizing. And you've already covered it a bit, but let's get in.
I think you just muted
Yeah, let's get into
there.
that as one of the themes of your book. And basically, what I'm talking about is this quote, remember, though, that Christian nationalism is not a religious creed, but a political one, which explains why its influence extends beyond the pews to the Republican Party's conservative base more broadly.
So Christian nationalism is this big baggy label, and scholars who study it don't really agree on what's in it because it's just a hodgepodge. It's a stew pot of lots of things. But what they do all agree on is it is, although it adopts symbolism and language of Christianity to some extent, it is a secular movement. It's a political movement. It's about power. It's about people like us, um, who are part of what they call Christian civilization, should dominate and rule politically. And that's what God wants, and it's what we want. So it's really about power. So if we open our Bibles and go to Matthew 4, we see one of the most important stories in the whole New Testament is Jesus has been baptized and he's getting ready to launch his ministry. But first, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days and nights. And there he encounters Satan, who takes him to the highest mountaintop in the world and shows him all of human dominion and says,
Mm,
you can have dominion over all of this if you'll bow down and worship me. And Jesus, of course, says, go away, Satan.
mhm,
He turns down that deal. He deliberately says, I don't want power in this world. I want power in the next world. And I want Christians to commit themselves to that kind of power, the godly power in the next life.
mm,
Okay, fast forward from, I don't know, 33 AD to 2016 AD. A guy named Donald Trump goes to a church, not, excuse me, goes to an evangelical college
mm,
in Iowa, and he says two things. Very few people know, Frank, that what I'm about to tell you, that these two things are in the same speech, but they are. He says, my followers are so loyal that I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue
yeah,
and they wouldn't mind. You've heard that quote.
yeah,
That's also the speech, the very same speech in which a little bit earlier he says, if you vote for me, if you elect me, you will have power. Remember that.
mm,
He's offering the same deal that Satan offered Jesus.
yeah,
I will give you power and you will give me unconditional loyalty.
mm,
White evangelicals take that deal. And that deal corrupts the church, at least according to many, many Christians who have looked at it.
yeah,
And the devotion to Donald Trump, the political figure, becomes idolatrous or almost idolatrous. And the church begins to, people in the church, Christians begin to behave on social media and in public life with often overt cruelty
mm,
and embracing policies that seem, deeply inconsistent with the teachings of the gospel, like defunding the PEPFAR program could kill 1.6 million people.
yeah,
That's the program that provides AIDS therapy and other therapies to people
mm,
in countries around the world. It's one of the great humanitarian triumphs
mm,
in all of human history. That just ended.
yeah,
So
and a lot of and many things too. By the way, an old friend of mine, Sierra Coop, was very much instrumental in battling for AIDS research and treatment for the
that's
gay
right.
community on
Christians
the
played an
basis of his
important
Christian
role.
faith, as part of his efforts as Surgeon General. We,
And one of my friends, I just have to give a shout out to my friend
yeah,
Rich Taffel, who's gay Christian,
yeah,
and in the 80s and 90s was one of the people who was instrumental in bringing along Republicans and Republicans of faith to the task of defeating AIDS.
yeah, yeah.
He's a minister.
You talk, just a quote here I want to get into. In today's America, we see evidence everywhere of the inadequacy of secular liberalism to provide meaning, exaltation, spirituality, transcendence, morality anchored in more than the self. So the flip side of what we're talking about is that in your book, you talk about the fact that a kind of liberal view that's secularized doesn't really provide a bulwark against what you're talking about because they haven't provided the things that people are basically looking for in their lives, which come from some form of spirituality. So I have a question for you because you're an atheist, and I would identify myself similarly. Um, and you talk in your book about how you regard death. And since you were a child, this isn't the idea of extinguishing yourself or being extinguished doesn't bother you. But on the other hand, you do make this plea for some sort of, excuse me, ethical view of life that provides this sense of meaning and transcendence. So you're in a kind of a peculiar position because you're writing a book which is essentially talking to Christians about what they have forgotten. Another book that I've read recently that's very similar is Dominion by Tom Holland, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And Tom Holland is a historian of ancient Rome, has a podcast called The Rest is History with Dominic Sandbrook. And he's written a whole book, I guess it's been out about 5 years, essentially saying that his study of ancient Rome led him to really reevaluate Christianity, not from the point of view of becoming a quote Christian himself, but from the point of view very much of the argument you make in your book. And that is, okay, if not this, then what? And for all its imperfections, why does a gay person do better in the United Kingdom than they do in Saudi Arabia? For all its imperfections, this culture is, rightly called Christendom, even including the slave trade, colonialism, and the rest of it. But let's just talk about the fact that without this moral ethical basis, the Universal Statement of Human Rights, the United Nations, and so forth, that they sort of pull out of thin air as if this has always existed somewhere, really only comes from this tradition. And he talks about the Reformation and so forth. So two questions. Are you aware of Tom's Holland's book, Dominion? And secondly, I find it very interesting that you two have written very different books, but you've actually come to a very similar conclusion. And I think that's kind of fascinating to me because I traveled out of that evangelical background, left it, and yet I'm running into you, to Tom Holland's book, to people who are saying, hey, wait a minute, before you glory in the secularization of our culture, what have you got left that's transcendent on the one hand, but also how's your political system going to work now? So just sort of go there wherever you want on my commentary.
That's interesting, Frank. I'd be interested in your journey because many people who've left the evangelical church carry some baggage with them of anger and hostility. And it sounds like that's not where you're coming from
Not at all.
either.
I'm 72 years old and life is too short. But there was a period, I think by writing a memoir, it was called Crazy for God. I kind of worked through some of those things. And fortunately, my editor, who also, who was a very secular person in New York City, said, hey, this is a very loving memoir about your parents. Now, a lot of evangelicals who read it were very angry with me because I came from a sort of a minor evangelical royalty, if you want to put it that way, and why I had abandoned my faith. But even then, 20 years ago when I was writing the book, I was sort of the mind I'm at now, but now even more so because, there's no kind of theoretical universe we can move to. We're here. And you talked about this 2,000-year-old tradition. And then, of course, that goes into a much older tradition in Judaism. Um, I would just fault the secular movement in general and the universities in particular, for instance, for not understanding that nothing they're doing makes sense without that cultural basis, whether you reject the religious, miraculous events or not. And I find that very interesting about your book because I've done a lot of reading in Tom Holland's book and very interested in it. And then to read your book was like the bookend of that. So he talks about coming out of Roman history and all its brutality. And, a Roman could rape his slave anytime he wanted, and there was no limit to it. And then he says, and this began to change when Jesus and Paul started talking about treasuring the least of these, and it is the first shall be last, and sort of threw all this power politics on its head. Now, your book is saying the same thing, except it's talking about a return to that, but at the same time offering a very coherent critique of what is loosely called the religious right or the Christian nationalist movement. Although I find it interesting that you say, in a way, there's no such thing as a Christian nationalist movement. When you try to nail it down, it's sort of, what is it? So I don't know. I've just thrown a bunch of stuff out, but I think
Well,
I'd like to
I'll
hear
see
you
if
talk about it.
I'll see if I can boil this all down in a coherent way because it really gets to the central theme of this book and why I think it's different from, other people writing books that say Christianity may not be true or religion may not be true, but it's good for society if people believe in it. I haven't written that kind of book. Um, There are people who say it's just good to believe in any religion or
Mm.
Christianity, or there are people who whitewash the very deeply checkered history
Sure.
of Christianity, which is very full of evil as well as good. I'm a gay American.
Yeah.
Christianity led a 60-year assault on people like me that caused
Mm.
untold damage, and
Mm.
it still hasn't apologized. So here's what's different about my book that I think helps inform this whole debate. I'm not talking about religion in general. This
Mm.
book is addressed to Christians about Christianity and what we need or at least hope for from them in our democracy right now. And it doesn't just talk about Christianity general, it talks about three core principles of Christianity that are the central pillars, according to theologians, of the religion, and that are also central pillars of our liberal democracy, where they translate into very similar. And the first of them we've talked about, it's don't be afraid. You also can't run a secular democracy if people are so afraid of losing the next election that they won't accept the results, or if
Mm.
people are so afraid that they follow a demagogue who tells them only I can protect you. The second is imitate Jesus.
Mm.
Jesus' ministry is it's distinctive in human history before then and largely after because it's radically egalitarian and it considers especially the interests of the least of these. It says
Mm.
all people are to be treated with dignity, and that goes especially for the poorest and weakest. That's how we judge ourselves, by
Mm.
how we treat the poorest and weakest. Secular liberalism says all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights,
Mm.
and it especially values the rights of minorities. That's the Bill of Rights. It says there's some things that no majorities can do that oppress minorities.
Mm.
Comes straight over. The third pillar of Christianity, forgive each other. Vengeance and retribution are the province of God, not man. That translates over into liberal democracy as, sometimes you win an election. Your
Mm.
goal is not to crush the other side, drive them out of the civic space, and salt the soil with the tears of their women and children. The goal is to treat them with the full decency of sharing the country with them as you will want them to do when they win an election,
Mm.
because otherwise, if you don't share the country, you can't have rotation in office and you won't have a constitution. So, what I'm saying is that the core elements of Jesus' teaching are way more like James Madison than they are like MAGA. And I'm saying those are the elements of Christianity which the church has drifted from, and which our country has drifted from,
Mm.
and which Christianity can help supply.
Mm. One thing that you talk about near the end of your book is this idea again with the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, their idea of agency. Just go into that a little bit because I find that very interesting. Unpack that a little bit and
It
why
is. Well,
that has had such a good effect on what they've been doing, particularly in view of, say, gay rights.
so agency is similar to free will, but with a subtle but important difference. I should say
Mm.
that, I went out to Salt Lake City. I talked to both ordinary people and senior members of the church. And far and away, the religious concept that came up most often was agency. This is
Mm.
right at the heart of their teaching. So, um, in their account of the Garden of Eden, Eve makes a choice to, of course, eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge and she and Adam then become aware of their moral surroundings.
Mm.
And they gain the ability to make moral choices. In conventional post Augustinian Christian theology, that's the fall. That's a bad thing. She defied God. That's also how I was brought up as a Jew.
Mm.
Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints, no, they say she did the right thing because she made it possible to make moral choices in life and thus exert the power of agency. So agency is like free will, which says we have the capacity to make moral choices,
Mm.
but it
Mm.
goes further and says we also need to have the opportunity to make choices, which means we have to be presented not with only right choices, but also with wrong choices.
Mm.
If we're not forced in the real world to be educated in the school of hard moral choices, we won't develop morally and thus we can't grow closer to God.
Mm.
So agency says we need to put ourselves in position where we have to make hard moral choices. It's
Mm.
super interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very short hop from the idea of having a world where you've got good and bad moral choices to a world of pluralism,
Yes.
which is a Madisonian concept, which says we want to live in a world where different people can make different choices and still live together.
Hmm.
That's why we have different state governments with different policies. That's why we have multiple branches of government. That's why we have so many different interest groups. Madisonian liberalism says we all need to try to engage in our different lifestyles and priorities, sometimes in competition, sometimes in cooperation, but we need
Yeah.
to be free to make these choices. So you're led on one path theologically, and on the other path, through the great tradition of, Madison and the
Mm.
founding fathers, to a similar conclusion, which is we need to share the country and allow people unlike us to make different choices than we would make.
I'm going to ask you one question just in closing out, and take all the time you want. We're not in a hurry. Um, what do you think the sort of liberal secular person in America needs to learn most urgently to repair the situation we find ourselves in? And on the other side, what do you think people who are authentically struggling to follow Christ, but at the same time have been swept up into this authoritarian regime Trump is hatching need to learn, and at what point can they learn something that's similar enough so that we can have this community again instead of this division? And do you think there is a way back? In other words, could we see us getting into a calamitous situation that's bad enough where everybody kind of says, well, wait a minute, what have we done? And rethink their basic presuppositions. So, what can the left, the liberal, the Democrat voting person who sort of started and maybe is still at where you were when you were younger do in terms of reconsidering some of their most basic and beloved presuppositions in order to become a citizen again and not part of, the party of the left? And then conversely, on the right, the person who's trying to follow Jesus, who actually can still be appealed to, what can we say to those two groups to get them to talk to each other again and give us some hope of getting past this calamity we're in the middle of with the Trump years?
Well, there's no one thing. There's all kinds of things, and some of them are secular. I'm a founding board member, no longer serve on the board, but I'm still an advocate and evangelist for Braver Angels, which is a national grassroots depolarizing movement,
Hmm.
and has a lot of different programs, but they tend to result in the same outcome, which is people leave these encounters realizing that we're not as divided as we've been led to believe.
Hmm.
We are more divided than we have been, and it's a big problem. But all the polls show people disagree on these policy issues less than they believe, and they're less different from each other than they believe.
Hmm.
And just showing them that reduces the amount of fear.
Hmm.
And once you reduce the amount of fear, you allow people to approach each other in a different political spirit. So, and there's lots of civic groups like that are doing work in this space. I encourage people to check out Braver Angels and
Hmm.
other civic groups. If I were doing one thing, a single thing, if you gave me a magic wand and said, how would you repair polarization and
Yeah.
toxicity in American political life? I'd say fix Congress.
Hmm.
It is the only institution in American life that acts or should act when it works as the big brokerage that reconciles the different regions, the two political parties, different factions, different priorities, goes through the business of deliberating and compromising out those issues so that we can live with each other. As long as Congress is broken, nothing else will work.
Hmm.
And there's a bunch more on the secular side. I mean, more than I could possibly get into. Um, on the religious side, so getting back to the province of this book, I actually think that in a way, Frank, the secular answer and the Christian answer is the same.
Hmm.
As I just discussed, those three core principles of Jesus, don't be afraid, forgive each other, um, and imitate Jesus, are principles that are equally valid whether you believe them because you think Jesus Christ died and was resurrected 3 days later,
Hmm.
or whether you believe them because they're the core tenets of liberal democracy. Either way, that's the direction to point in.
Hmm.
And so that means the prescription in that sense is similar to both.
Hmm.
If secular people could reacquaint themselves with how much Christianity has to offer to help heal and strengthen our country. I think it would reduce the amount of hostility that the secular and fear that the secular world feels. And I think if Christians would elevate those aspects of their teaching, the core aspects of those teachings, which can help heal and strengthen our democracy,
Mm.
and I think heal and strengthen Christianity itself, then that also, I think, could help repair and strengthen our
Mm.
democracy. So I find myself in this weird position, but position of saying, hey, there's something fundamental and important in the message of Christianity. If only we could get more Christians and more secular people to pay attention.
Yeah, and this, of course, is what your book is about. So we have been talking with Jonathan Rauch, and his book, Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken, Bargain with Democracy, is going to be, it has to be read, June offering. And the only thing I would ask you, Jonathan, before we go here, is I will sign off in a moment. Could you just stay on for a couple seconds afterwards and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, because we'd like to do two things. First of all, just get ideas that you might have of people we should be talking to, because now you've been on with that. There's maybe other authors or friends, people, for instance, this group you were talking about that we don't know about, that we should be interviewing someone and making this known to people who listen to our podcast. So please give Ernie some ideas, and also anything you want us to link to. And the book obviously is one of them for our book club, but just stay a moment and talk to Ernie if you don't mind.
I'd be happy to, and thank you for having me on the show.
Hey, listen, in all honesty, I just was thunderstruck by the book. I just, you run out of words because they're used too much in blurbs, in important, must read, and so forth. But I mean all that. And like I say, it bookends something I've been reading and thinking about a lot, which is Tom Holland's Dominion. And I would just say these two books, um, if you were going to offer any kind of a study of contemporary culture and what to do positively for it, these would be my top recommendations right now. So,
Well, I'm honored that you say that, and I should also say that ex-evangelicals, which I think is what you are, the
yeah,
phrase ex former evangelicals,
right.
they're in an important cultural position right now,
Mm,
acting as cultural translators. And the fact that you split from the church at
mm,
some personal cost without carrying a grudge and baggage,
mm,
there's work that you and people like you can do to
mm.
remind us that we still need each other, the secular world and the Christian world.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that very much. And your book struck that chord within me. So thank you, because it's something that I'm part of. But anyway, with much love and much affection for you in the book, I'm going to sign off and ask you to give some good ideas to our producer, Ernie, who's a wonderful person, by the way. And please chat with him for